Good morning and welcome to A Line of Defence, an objective look at trade credit insurance. I'm here with Mary. How are you this morning, Mary?
Good. Interesting topic.
What are we going to discuss today?
Well, we're going to look at trade credit insurance as an industry, but more of a focus on why it's not as popular in Australia and New Zealand as we see in other parts of the world.
Fantastic. And from an objective perspective, there's a lot out there on the value of trade credit insurance and why people purchase it. Today we'd like to take a bit of a look at why people choose not to, and also take a bit of a deep look into the Australian psyche from the perspective of the typical Australian business owner.
Yeah, just a different way of looking at the product and the industry than the traditional you should buy it because, or this is good for you because. It's just a different spin this time, which I think will be quite interesting.
Now, before we get into that, Mary, you'll be aware that one of my favourite business podcasts, Fear and Greed, the presenter there, Sean Aylmer, is often referred to as the Oracle of Orange. I've been trying to come up with something similar for yourself, and I've landed with the Navigator of Newtown. Now, that's obviously a bit to do with your global travel, but also how you've, down through your career, nurtured and mentored a lot of colleagues and shown them the direction on where they can go in their careers, as well as being a compass for the product in the sense of...
What is going on here?
in the sense of helping the product evolve in Australia, which is something we're going to look at later when we discuss the future of trade credit insurance. But first of all, looking at your career, is there any memorable clients or customers or experiences?
Oh gosh, it's a long history. It's 30 years. Look, for me, the most memorable, which we can't talk about customers necessarily here, but some of the most memorable experiences I've had are probably with our brokers, to be honest. I'd never used to deal with brokers before, but having been introduced to them, they're different people, and the way they try and promote the product and how they navigate through this industry themselves.
Yeah.
So I think they're probably the most interesting for me.
Mary, as part of your current role and previously with EFIC, you were fortunate to travel around the world and experience different markets and particularly meet a lot of different brokers and policyholders from different parts of the world. Have you noticed any difference in the policyholders or the attitude to trade credit in Australia compared to other parts of the world?
Definitely. I think there's a huge difference. We look at our multinational customers here. A lot of them take out credit insurance because their parent overseas takes out credit insurance for the group. They put it all together under one umbrella. It doesn't normally come naturally to the customers here, or it hasn't for most of them. Some of them. The parent values the product. They see a lot of benefits to it. It's only when something goes wrong or a company is allowed to grow through the use of the product that the Australian companies see the value in it. So it's not something that they would normally say, yep, this is what I need, or this is going to really help me. It's almost an incentive through the parent to take it out. So that's the main difference. It's harder to convince an Australian company of the benefits of the product than it would be in other parts of the world.
And to look at that a bit deeper and try and sketch out the DNA of the average Australian business owner and how they view things with quite an optimistic outlook, perhaps, compared to other parts of the world. What would you say to somebody who says, I don't really need this product, I know my customers for the last 30 years and I've never had a bad debt?
This is the typical she'll be right attitude that we see in the DNA of Australian business culture. It's not unusual. It's not just in business culture. It goes throughout Australian society, in my view anyway. The attitude of she'll be right comes from this optimism and resilience and the fact that, or the belief that time will heal or time will fix things. When someone says that to me, I always think to myself and then try and verbalise to them that it's not about trusting your customer. We know you trust your customer. We know you think you'll get paid. We know your buyer intends to pay you. Nobody really, well, most do not go into business to scam people. They don't go into business to not pay them. So when they think she'll be right, I'll get paid eventually or it'll be okay, I know this person, It's not necessarily the best way to look at the way you run your business through using this product. I try and encourage them more to think, if I don't take out the product, what are the consequences for me? That's probably more of an important question. Even if you believe you might get paid, are you 100% sure? There is never 100% certainty in anything. So for me, the she'll be right attitude is great because of the optimism. It creates a certain persona, but it also could lead to complacency and just letting the ball drop perhaps at the wrong moment.
Well, I think you're right. And before coming today, I contacted some of our trusted brokers and asked what the typical roadblocks or the traditional objections are to trade credit insurance. And one of them actually used those exact words. She said, you can sum it up in 3 words, she'll be right. That's a philosophy in Australia. And while people don't use that term as much anymore, it definitely is part of the outlook in life, and actually have found that there's a book out there called She'll Be Right,
or Will She?
A Journey into the Australian Psyche by Near Corn. A very interesting book, not just reviewing that, but reviewing contemporary Australian culture and tracing back the actual origins of that term to the 1850s, when there was the original gold rush, and a guy called Edward Hargreaves tried his hand over in California at finding gold and had very little luck, and returning home realised that the countryside of Orange and the countryside of Bathurst resembled quite a bit the countryside of California, and started digging for gold, and eventually struck lucky, and in the next 10 years 600,000 people had come to Australia to try their luck.
The birth of the lucky country in the eyes of the rest of the world.
Exactly.
Really.
Yeah, the population practically doubled overnight, and the way that the country is viewed changed from a British penal colony to one to be proud of, and rich in natural resources.
And you see that today. You do see it today, because a lot of companies will say, well, I know this person well, I know the owner really well. We have barbecues together. We see each other on the weekends. Our families sometimes may know each other. But the issue is, that's great, and that's a great way to grow your business, to network, to protect your business. But what you don't know is, you don't know what's behind the scenes. You know the person, you know what they're doing, but do you really know what's behind the scenes, what's happening in their own company, whether it's here or overseas? You don't necessarily know that. So as a company, you're looking at it from a completely different lens than the way a credit insurer would look at it. We would have a little bit more of what I would call an objective lens, with no offence meant, of course, but an objective lens than you would as a customer looking at the way you deal with your buyer.
And do you think that's typically an Australian trait, where business owners place trust or the strength of the relationship and weight it on such a high level within the context of their business decisions?
Maybe more in the past, not as much these days, but I still see it there. I still feel like it's there. But I could ask you the same thing. I mean, you're from County Galway, and Galway is known as the Happy City. It has over 120 festivals a year, so there's obviously a party atmosphere going on in Galway. And Ireland itself also has this, we call it She'll Be Right. You say it'll be grand or grand. Yep. Still trying my pronunciations.
Getting
it'll
better.
Be grand. So do you see that, having been there and then coming to Australia, do you see a similarity in that approach to businesses? I mean, you're in sales now, you work in a sales capacity. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think Australia is a great place to work. There's 3 key things about working in Australia. I find that people are very down to earth. Regardless of your set of circumstances, there's an expectation to be down to earth. It's almost a core value in Australian business. There's a great sense of humour. People don't take themselves too seriously. One of our underwriters down in Melbourne, she lives beside a swimming school, and it's called the Harold Holt Swimming School, which is named after Harold Holt,
Prime Minister,
who famously disappeared in the water. But also the optimistic outlook. I think that even going back to 30 years ago, when John Howard was Prime Minister, he wanted Australians to be comfortable, relaxed and comfortable in their life and not have burdens or worries. And I think that's changed. I think life moves a lot faster now than it did 30 years ago. The baby boomers were able to purchase a property which would cost probably 8 times their annual salary. That's not the case today. There's unpredictability on a macroeconomic level, things like COVID, which we saw in our own industry, which caused the collapse of a number of builders, St Hilliers, ProBuild, for example, the rising costs, the fixed contract, all of those things that were unseen and unpredictable, and regardless of the strength or the trust of the relationships that were retained in those cases, those businesses ultimately failed. In the case of Porter Davies Homes, most recently, we saw a similar scenario. One of the biggest builders where everybody had faith that the business would survive, but as you mentioned, things were going on behind closed doors. That meant looking at a balance sheet at one point in time, historically, was no longer as up to date as the current cash flow issues that the business was.
Yeah, but also trusting. I think a lot of Australian businesses and people are generally trusting. So when a business gets in trouble and a plan comes out, they trust that it's going to be fixed. It'll be okay. Money's going to get poured into the business. But again, what we're missing is what's behind the scenes. We're trusting at a surface level because that's all we can see.
Yeah.
It's about what's happening behind the scenes, and this is where that different lens that I'm talking about comes in. And that's the unpredictable lens. During COVID, of course, there was a lot of interest in the product, in credit insurance, because there's this uncertainty. What's going to happen? We don't know. Do you feel like that's tapered off now when we're back to it'll be okay, see, we got through that? Do you feel that that's coming in now?
COVID was interesting with regards to the government support that was lent to a lot of businesses, which allowed the typical businesses, or the standard average number of businesses that would go insolvent every year, stay afloat. And that's been well documented in how people talk about the zombie companies and so on. And meanwhile, the ATO wasn't as quick at following up outstanding debts as they typically are, and giving businesses a bit of space to breathe. The banks also did similar. We're back now to where we saw a spike in claim insolvency activity in August 2020. So the December-January numbers are that 5.1% of businesses are going insolvent. That's forecast to rise to 5.6% this year in 2025. The hospitality sector, for example, is under a lot of pressure at the moment. Costs of products are going up. The working from home balance and the cost of living and inflation is having impact with their standard or average footfall. And we're also seeing in the business in the construction sector, which is typically one of the champion industries in Australia, that businesses are continuing to do it tough. Jerry Harvey came out recently talking about how difficult it is to develop at this point in time and enter into a profitable business or contract. So there's a lot of pressures out there, and I feel that life is a lot less predictable now than it was in the late 90s.
Yeah, that's what's concerning now. What are the attitudes towards protecting your business, growing your business, given what people have gone through in the last 3 or 4 years? And you do see a difference in the various states as well. Yeah. Some states were much harder. Of course, the state you come from was much harder living than it was here. So people are out a lot more. But I wonder whether that sense of trusting and she'll be right has been impacted by that.
I think individuals, if they're being completely honest with themselves, while they really embrace the she'll be right, the larrikin image that Australia has as a country individually, I think they'll be open to say that just the world is a lot more dangerous place nowadays, and that certainly from a business context, that there's things like cybercrime that there wasn't at the same level years ago, and other unseeable measures like you spoke about before that they have to try and protect themselves from. And I think that's where it becomes quite difficult for the trade credit insurance product when a business is trying to run and all the cost of their standard premiums are going up, and they're being asked to take an additional line of defence in trade credit insurance.
Yeah, and also, as you're talking about in the last few years, the changes here, if I look back, I always feel old when I say it, but if I look back even 20 years, 25 years ago, when I first started in the industry, Australia was this really isolated, very isolated, not just geographically, but just isolated from a business sense.
Yeah.
But we can see even in the last 15 years, Australia has a bit more or a lot more of a presence on the world stage. That's a positive aspect, but there's always a flip side to that. Do you think that having that presence on the world stage exposes us a little bit more to different types of risks?
That's a great question, Mary, and I have been thinking about that quite recently regarding the relationship with China and how it's impacted our wine industry particularly, and a lot of the tariffs that are being looked at in the US at the moment, and how that could potentially be an advantage or disadvantage for Australian exporters. It's easier said than done when the business advice is, when your main export market like China has closed down, just go and find another market. I think Australian businesses do value trade credit product hugely when exploring in markets overseas, that they don't have the same level of information as they would do working domestically, and also that they have the protection of collections in the event that something goes wrong. I feel that as an export country, we can probably do a lot better, comparable to New Zealand, for example. You would have seen from your time in EFIC the options that are out there to export. And with the Australian dollar where it is at the moment, it's actually helping our export industry. What do you think about exploring in different markets as a business owner? Where would be the first place you would start?
It really does depend on your product. Like with anything, just back to basic economics, there's got to be a demand for what you're selling or what you're making. Once you know where that demand can come from, that's where you've got to start pitching. You need to be there. I think the days of telexes and using on-the-ground trade commissioners to try and help you set up or to win business, I think they're gone. I think there's a lot more need to physically be present in that market. It doesn't mean you need to set up a business there to start, but you need to be there. You need to be meeting people. A lot of people do have mixed views on things like trade fairs or trade missions, but I think they are a really good start. Yep. Otherwise, how do you know that this is where the demand is going to be? And the reason I mentioned Australia on the world stage also is around this point, because a lot of countries do form blocks now and try and make sure that they are protecting themselves and the bloc. So if Australia is not aware of that, then we could again be isolated if we're not looking how to grow some of those markets for some of the products, particularly because we still sell the same things. Mostly, we sell the same things we were selling 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whereas a lot of other countries have progressed into more deeper manufacturing, even technology. We're not as progressed as some of those, I would say.
Yeah. And with regards to any particular examples where you've gone out to meet clients and sit with them and got to understand their business. I love when we go out and do a buyer visit, for example, on behalf of one of our clients. I always call it and talk to the team and say it's like a streetwise MBA, because you sit down, you don't just go through a balance sheet and profit and loss, but they'll go through their entire business forecast for the next 5 years. And it can be anything from retail to construction to food and beverage, and you get a real insight into how the industry runs. Do you have any experiences or examples when you sat with the business in a consultant capacity and felt good about the fact that you were actually helping the business by providing the advice that you were on trade credit?
Yeah, especially when it came to export markets, because that was back in those days, that was our speciality, visiting a lot of export markets, understanding the economic and the geopolitical aspects or characteristics. But what I used to find more interesting is when you could just sway their thought a little bit, get them to think differently, as I was saying earlier, from a different lens. So there was back in the days again, and when I used to do sales, there was large companies we'd go and see and trying to prospect and say, are you interested in this? We can help you. This is what we can do. One of the biggest objections was, or lines of no, we don't need this, was I can take this hit. I'm big enough, or even if they're not big enough, look, most of my buyers are small. I can take this hit. Or the most common one, we provision for bad debts, so we'll be fine. But I used to turn that a little bit and say, I appreciate that you could probably survive a loss of whatever magnitude they might have predicted, or that you provision. But isn't the better question, what could you have done with that money instead? Could that money have gone into more investments or investment generating income, in fact, rather than say,
Get
yes,
the money
I can
to work for
afford
you.
that today.
Yeah.
Exactly. But not everybody got there, so it's always looking at it from a different lens, because we're sitting at very opposite ends. We're trying to achieve the same thing. We want you to get paid, we want you to grow the business. That's what they want. But again, a very different mindset, very different.